All right. Hey everyone. Glad you could make it to this presentation. My name is Alex Karasick. I'm joined here with my colleagues from the Strand Simulations Group, and we are here to hopefully present this presentation, Recentering Red: New Approaches to Game Design. So we formed this company in 2022. We all met during our studies at King's. We all had a strong interest, shared fondness for wargaming, and we were really able to build upon that in our studies. And since then, after graduation, we've built that into this company you see before you. So one area we really found we tend to focus a lot on was experimenting with the kinds of games that we could build, and especially a shared fondness for playing Red when we had the chance. So with that, we thought it would be particularly interesting to bring that to the play and kind of approach that with how building Red in games can be done. So each of us is going to kind of approach different ways of playing or building Red, different kinds of Red in games, and how that is worth looking at more in depth. And I hope you'll find it very interesting. So with that, I will start. So next slide. Next slide. Sorry about that. So with that, I'm going to start. My name's, again, as I said, Alex Karasick, and what I'm going to look at is building around Red, flipping the equation. So really how to build a Red game. So next slide. So before we can ask how to build a Red game, we do have to ask, what is red teaming? You know, I'm sure multiple other discussions in this conference have discussed it, but I think it's still worth bringing up. So red teaming is at its core it depends on what you need the red team to do. It has to be multifaceted. It can do anything from challenging preconceived notions, forcing decision makers to respond to emerging threats, training and adapting strategy, forcing the inclusion of domains that aren't otherwise considered, and planning and predicting both the unknown and the not yet happened. So as you can see in this image, which is from the UK Ministry of Defence's red teaming guide, there is all kinds of things which red teaming can do, and then even more that's not listed on this guide. But I think it's still worth understanding just the massive just amount of options available for a red team. I think it's also very, very important to understand that red teaming is as much an exercise in psychology as it is in planning and gaming. A lot of what you're doing is also running on how you can metagame the game, not just how the game itself is built. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about building around red. So next slide. What does building around red really look like? Well, in my opinion at least, building around red is creating a game with the intention of providing both the freedom of action and freedom of reaction for players, both within and adjacent to the game. So there's no obviously single system that makes a game a red game, but instead there's a lot of factors and different techniques in game building that can really play a role in making a game a red game. But you need to make sure a couple key factors. You need to make sure that there's the freedom for these sides to work creatively, both red and blue, but also with enough guides that they don't start the game overwhelmed and lost. You have to make sure there's an atmosphere that enables both sides to experiment and just be creative. It also means creating a game with the understanding that red may well seek to find a way to break it. And either that's through the rules itself, through interpersonal interactions, some other way, and understanding that if red breaks the game, it doesn't make the game bad. There's always a learning experience to be had from red if they're able to successfully break the game. Whether it's about the game design or about what the game can teach us overall, depends, but it's not something necessarily to fear in game design. I also, it bears noting, building around blue does not necessarily make the game itself bad, depending on what you wish for the game to be. But it severely limits what red is capable of doing, and it severely ends up limiting the creativity of actions. So with that in mind, let's look at some examples of a blue and a red game. So next slide. So I think a great example of a game built around blue is the game Hegemony by the Rand Corporation. This is a game built around teaching blue how to hedge against threats and resource allocation. It does so by having 4 blue players, 3 from the U.S. The U.S. Department of Defense, 1 from NATO, against 4 members of red, the DPRK, Iran, Russia, and China. And in this case, there's a series of steps through signaling where red signals threats through cards, blue hedges against those threats, and then it continues back and forth. The biggest issue with this game is fundamentally red serves very little functional purpose other than minutely advancing the game state. This isn't a game where red is truly testing blue, and in a lot of ways, what red does in this game can just as easily be done through random chance or automation. You could be flipping 3 random cards and probably get about the same result without significant red meddling. And that's a bit of an issue. You can make the game, in fairness, less rigid, but at its core, even without the matrix adjudication that can be added, all you really have as red is a set deck of red cards with very little difference between what you're doing. You can either, as Russia, do minor gray area operations in country of your choice, or major gray area operations in country of your choice, or major cybersecurity action in country of your choice if you're China. But fundamentally, it feels very one-dimensional. There's not really room for red to experiment, and that also means there's not really room for blue to approach experimentation. So, with that, let's look at the opposite, what a red game would be. So next slide. I think an interesting example of a red game would be Rex Brennan's Brainania simulation. I think there's a lot of things that this does that take a very more red approach, and I think it's worth looking at what some of those are. So, to go a bit more in depth, the Brainania simulation is a week-long peace-building simulation that Rex Brennan runs for his Poly 450 class over at McGill, and it takes place at the start in the middle of a civil war in the fictional country of Brainania and continues all the way along to eventual ceasefire, peace-building, and post-conflict reconstruction negotiations, should any of those come to pass. But the scenario itself is very open-ended, and I think this is one of the first and most important things to building a good red game. The scenario starts, despite being a peace-building game, it's entirely possible for the game to actually end without peace ever being achieved. It's a game that starts and still guides the players by starting with a hurting stalemate, which is likely going to push players towards some form of negotiation, but not in a way that forces them to do it in a single way, and not in a way that like necessitates them to actually end up in this situation. It's fully possible, as I said, for the red players to simply refuse to go into any negotiations whatsoever. And the game is able to react to that potential outcome and also do additional actions if need be. So by building it in this way, the players are given a much greater freedom of choice. Because it's open-ended, they're able to choose whether they want to escalate, de-escalate, how they want to interact with the other teams, how they want to interact between red and between blue, or between red and red, or blue and blue. So a lot of these lead towards encouraging creative thinking, encouraging experimentation amongst the players. And you really do tend to see it in the results from the game itself. Building upon this, the openness of action is also an important thing to consider. While the adjudication in the game is done through emails sent to white, it's also possible to use interpersonal interactions either through formal or informal meetings in person or online, again, provided the documentation is given to white. But from these meetings, you're able to use all these kinds of different actions, which wouldn't really make sense to just tell red you want to have white you want to have adjudicated. Something like, for example, if you're in DDR negotiations for disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, it wouldn't make sense to turn to white and say, I wish to lie to the United Nations official in front of me and say that I have successfully demobilized when I have not. Instead, in the game, you can functionally turn to the UN official who is sitting across from you and lie to their face. And the ability to do this is honestly huge. the ability to break the game, not through actually breaking the game, but through using the psychological aspect, it's crucial to the like openness that the game can provide. Another thing I think that's really worth considering is the number of roles the game allows for. It not only allows for a large number of roles that don't easily fit definable roles of red or blue. For example, you have regional powers, superpowers, NGOs, trade unions, the UN, the media, and even like affluent philanthropic donors. And all of these are able to freely interact with the different factions on the ground as they see fit or as their player briefings might encourage. So already there's a large number of cases where what isn't red is somewhat blurred. Building upon this, you also have a large number of red factions. You have at least 4 different key red factions: the Popular Front for Liberation of Zakaria, Zakarian People's Front, Free People's Army, and Eastern Caucasian Freedom Movement, which each have their own distinct goals and capabilities, but in the process of being 4 distinct entities, also allow for red on red interaction in addition to the classic red on blue interaction. So it's fully possible to have a game where red starts negotiating with other parts of red to do something, or red starts negotiating or fighting other parts of red. And that again provides another set of open-ended abilities. Red can choose how they want to not only interact with their opponents, but who their opponents functionally are. It's fully possible again to have, once you get to the peace building, for example, some or more of these groups to decide to be spoilers, and that spoiling tends to emerge naturally. And how they choose to do this, again, is very open-ended. But it's the ability for these things to kind of emerge. I keep using naturally, but naturally, organically, holistically. The fact that these things can emerge without having to be directly forced by white is really crucial to understanding what makes a good red game. This is a truly an example of what it means to see creativity and experimentation in action. If these things, which you otherwise would see in real life, can naturally happen through player interaction and reaction. So, at its core, again, I think how it's meeting player interaction and how it's eschewing rigidity are 2 ways where it really does succeed in being a red game. So, let's go to the next slide. And in general, how can we kind of work towards incorporating red? Based on these examples, based on the broad understanding of what makes a red game, what are some ways that we can incorporate and center red in our game design? Well, at its core, consider how the players are interacting with each other as well as the game. Like I said, the psychological aspect is really important to understanding how red is going to play your game. And if you're not accounting for that, you're already limiting what red can or can't do. Providing these opportunities and openings for creative thinking, either in your rules, your adjudication specifically, or even your scenario design, again, looking towards Brainania as an open-ended scenario. These can all strongly affect the way that red and blue are interacting and the way that red feels like they can or cannot do certain actions. And also, consider what roles you want red to serve and how they'd best represent it. It's possible what you really want for red is to predict what a future scenario might be, which in the indeterminate future, you have to give them more freedom of opportunity because functionally, we just don't know what will happen in 40 years. But it might be, for example, you have to give red a much more rigid series of options because what you need to look at is more rigid. In a case like that, understanding what you need red to do, what role you need red to serve, is important more than probably anything else in how you're building around red, obviously, but it still bears noting. So, with that, looking at how to build around red, there's still a large number of games that are built around blue. So, with that next slide, it also, I think, bears noting if you are playing red in a blue game, how do you do it? And I think this is also worth considering, just again, because there's a lot of games built today which are blue games. They don't really consider red beyond either uh, as a broad actor or they make their abilities very rigid. So what can you do as red in a blue game? Well, I think there's three real main approaches. You can force the consideration of new systems or new domains, especially ones which are harder to adjudicate. You can, for example, claim, well, if we were to do this, it would lead to sanctions from country X. So we need to consider that. We need to consider the dime aspects that we don't otherwise have built into this game. The benefit being if you can add these systems, there's a chance they'll be looser and there's a chance that you can work with them as a new area of attack. You can come up with something creative out of this. Another option is you find a way to break the rules of the game, either written or intended rules. So in the case of, say, hegemony, if you could get all four red players, the DPRK, Iran, Russia, and China, to single-handedly cooperate on what turn they choose their most destructive action, so for example, all four of them were to invade their neighboring countries at once, you can overwhelm blue and create a scenario where blue actually is faced with a genuine choice of how they must hedge against four equally significant threats, which you probably wouldn't see in how hegemony tends to normally be played out. The third thing you can do is you can break the unspoken or unintended rules of the game. This is, I think, where psychology most plays a direct role, because unspoken rules such as red does not lie to blue can be broken to great effect. And even in rigid games, these things are usually not specified. The idea of metagaming it out or finding a way to break the rules of the game is fundamentally the best approach red can take when given a rigid blue game. And the results tend to be that red is going to give something very unique and probably very important to consider if they can successfully do this. I've seen an example given where um, if you look at, for example, the deployment of a large number of a lot of malware happens through USBs that are plugged in by someone who found it laying on the ground. Something like 60% or something of people who find USBs like this on the ground will plug it in. Being able to say that, yes, we want to deploy our malware through this is really important and something if you can find a way to force that into a game will absolutely play a role, and that is the psychology in action. Knowing that people are vulnerable to doing this is something the game should be considering. So with that, next slide. Uh, just going to go into a short conclusion. So what is building around red? Building around red is building a more open and permissive game. Like I said, you want to give this freedom of action, you want to give this freedom of reaction, and you want to build a game knowing that red is able to do what they want, that they're not constrained, but that they're still guided from being too overwhelmed. And if you can successfully do this and you can successfully find a way to make sure that red is best represented, in my opinion, you're going to make a good game. So that is the end of my presentation. And with that, I will go to the next slide and leave it to my colleague, Thomas Danger.
Thank you very much, Alex, for all those informations. So my name is Thomas Danger. Yeah, Danger, like the danger, a good name for a red gamer. So I will talk from my personal experience about the design of certain kind of games, which I call all red player game. And I will take the example of turf war politics to explain what are those games, why they are interesting, and what you can do with them, and how you will design them. Next slide, please. So, what I am talking about here, when I say that everyone can be red, it's actually quite a common style of game you can find everywhere. I will define that basically as a kind of game where there is no definition of what is red from an external point of view. For instance, if you have a game being played and you are bringing an external actor observing the game, that person will be unable to distinguish a blue and a red player. That will be an all-red game. This is quite a flexible definition because it will allow you to have multiple players within a game with radically political, ideological differences with one another, and you will still not be able to distinguish a clear-cut separation between blue and red. Next slide, please. So as I said, there is many examples of all red game. One that I like is Versailles 1919. The main players during the negotiations, the French, the Americans, the Italians, the British. And from an external point of view, you can't tell whether someone is blue or red. Obviously, the British player will say, I'm blue, and the other might be red. But an external person, someone exterior to the game, will not be able to detect that. Another famous example, I would say, is Aftershock, where you can't say that there is red players. Well, you can't say that there is a blue and a red players, but at the same time, all the players are competing for resources during that humanitarian crisis. Therefore, they will be all red to one another. Mm. One less famous example is given in a book written by John Prados, and there is multiple war games inside of Pentagon Games, and one of those games is called Pentagon Monopoly in the Military, and in that game, it's a defense acquisition procurement game where you have a player playing the army, one the navy, and one the air force, and they will all fight over the budget and compete with one another. Again, they are all playing technically in the same faction, the U.S. Armed Forces. They are all playing U.S. They are all playing blue, but actually there is no clear-cut distinction between a blue and a red player. They are all playing red into circumstances. Next slide, please. So why do you want to design this kind of games? Why are they useful compared to a traditional blue versus red game format? Uh, from my personal experience in designing games, one of the most interesting things this kind of games can offer are better understanding of internal dynamics of, for example, a faction or an institution or an alliance. Um, it works very well with software politics. For example, there is over there an example of a game I created for the Bundeswehr, where you are all also playing branches of the Bundeswehr armed forces. So you have the army, you have the navy, the air force, and there is multiple industrial player. It's quite yeah, and all of those players are competing with one another. However, they are all playing in the same camp. So you can see that they're all sitting around the table, all playing cooperatively with one another because they are technically part of the same team, the same Bundeswehr, and the same country, Germany. But at the same time, they are all competing with objectives. And avoiding a clear-cut definition between blue and red will allow them to have better way to negotiate. This is something that Alex emphasized previously. You can better work on psychology. You can better work with interpersonal relationship compared to a blue-red game where interpersonal relationships will probably play less an important factor. Next slide, please. How would you design an all-red game? There is no single answer that I could provide, but there is three general direction, three general guidelines that I could give. The first one will be the importance of objective. It's very important to well design, to think about what you're writing down, especially the wording. The wording will be very important for the objective you're giving to the players, because if they can't if there is no clear-cut distinction between blue and red, they will focus even more on the objective, and those objectives will have an even greater importance compared to a blue versus red game. Especially if they are all playing in the same faction. For example, the Bundeswehr with the army, the navy, and the air force. They are all playing in the same army, and their objective will not be so quite different, probably. So you want to be very careful how you phrase them. A second important mechanic that you should include in the game design of such a game is allowing negotiations and nuances within a game. You need to let the players negotiate with one another. You need to create a game where you can create a spectrum between 100% and 0% in terms of cooperation to allow players to communicate, to lie, maybe to take measure together, but then abandon an alliance. Maybe so. Look at the players playing on of my game over there. Some of the players are going behind in the room to negotiate with one another, but that alliance is temporary alliance they are creating will not last long. So you need to think of elements of game design to allow negotiations. Even if you're talking about a rigid game, even in a rigid Kriegspiel, you should be able to create elements within this game, allowing a better, allowing a ground for negotiation. A third element, which is not really a game design element, but rather something to keep in the back of your mind, is embracing chaos. Those kind of game where all players are red are chaotic by essence. Because instead of having a traditional blue versus red divide, you will have 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, maybe 7 teams. Because every player will be for himself, and every player will negotiate differently with one another. So those games can be very chaotic. So in the way you manage the game, the adjudication, for example, or maybe the rule book, you need to give space, allowing you to embrace the chaos of the game. That's something very important. You can see the example of such a game, War in Zimbabwe. It's a game about counter-insurrection in Mali that I ran last year at Connection NL in Breda. You can see it was very chaotic because each of the player will play a distinct faction, and it was complicated as I've got 10 players, so you really need to think about it. Another problem, a problem that might emerge from all red games like that. I will give an example. One of the players over there played ISIS, and as ISIS, he took a lot of fun bombing, kidnapping, doing war crimes, basically. And at the end of the game, I asked him, why did you do that? His answer was, well, I'm ISIS, I'm crazy. That's not a satisfactory answer from a game design perspective for a lot of reasons. Next slide, please. So it's quite, you can see sometimes that problem of players not being very realistic. That's an article of Rex Bryan that I've put over there, Wargaming Unpredictable Adversaries. In that article, Rex Bryan underlines that in a game he designed with the US intervening in the Middle East, you have an Iran player. And that Iran player will do crazy thing. Why? Well, I'm Iran, so I'm doing crazy stuff. Same thing. I have the same problem with my Mali game that I showed previously. Sometimes your players will not be very realistic. One of the solutions for that will be to bring all red game element of game design and bring them into your thinking to create more realistic red player. How to do that? The idea will be to take your, for example, Iran player and break it into multiple players, which will create a faction that is dividing between different players. For example, instead of just having Iran, you would have someone playing the Revolutionary Guard, someone playing the army, and someone playing the civil society. And all those factions within Iran, because of the competition with one another, will be very careful about what they are doing and will be far less careless when acting on the international stage. If they know that not only there is a blue or red player in front of them, for example, the US, but at the same time, within their own faction, their own camp, there is someone else trying to kick them in the ass, you will have a far more realistic player at the end. And that's an interesting element of game design because you will be not only you will be able to bring it's not only useful for all red game but also for blue versus red game. I put the example of a model over there. Well, traditionally you will have the blue team against the red team. If you want a more realistic either blue or red player, you would, for example, create multiple factions within each of the team. So create a mini all-red game within one of the faction, one of the team, the blue team, and another all-red game within the other team, the red game. So you will have two layers of competition, one with the external adversary and one with the internal adversary. One example that I like is if you want to design, for example, an historical wargame about, let's say, Korea, the Korean War, you would have a North Korean player, you would have a Chinese player, and you will have a US player. Well, instead, if you want to bring more realism, I'm not saying that it is perfect. I'm saying it is a way to improve realism in the game through competition. To add a bit more realism, you will break the US player into saying one is playing Truman, one is playing MacArthur, one is playing the State Department, and you will have fighting turf war politics within one faction, but at the same time competing with other red. And I think it's a very interesting thing to have. And one last note on this kind of game: it's not easy to design them because you will need to break the traditional chain of command and make what's vertical horizontal. With the example I gave earlier, well, Truman is at the top, you have MacArthur under, and the State Department somewhere. Well, technically, you have a vertical chain of command, so Truman is able to say whatever he wants to MacArthur. So you will need able to give abilities to the players, capacity, cards, whatever, allowing him to have influence despite the fact that he should be hierarchically under someone else. That will be that's a challenge that can be, I think, solved, but you need to keep that element in mind. I think that's gonna be all for me. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I will hand over to my colleague. So next slide, please, and thank you very much to have listened to me.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Natan Pawłowski, and within Strand Simulations Group, most of the work I have done so far was to do with historical themed games and some in terms of mega games as well. And basing on my historical games experience, I would like to discuss how red teaming fits into that and how it works differently in historical games than it does in games in general. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So generally, the first and foremost issue with historicity in wargaming is to have some semblance of realism. And by that, I generally mean the idea that the game itself and the design, as well as the players, are able to fit the realities in which the game is set. Compared to games set in contemporary settings, that is a rather unique problem. Depending on how distant and niche the topic, area, and timing of the game are, players might find it anywhere between a bit tricky to outright impossible to find themselves immersed in the setting, and more importantly, to understand it, and what comes with it to act like you could expect actors within such a setting. As an example, purposefully, an example being incredibly niche and not terribly popular as a game topic. Let's say there is a game where players are the main actors during the First Northern War in the Baltic, late 1500s. Without very specialized knowledge about the period, location, and the specific conflict, the players are likely to default to playing as they would any contemporary game or to any historical game that, in their opinion, fits the theme the closest. In that case, the players are not taking part in a scenario, are not immersed in the scenario, they're only playing against a game, they're only trying to achieve whatever goals are set in the game, but they do not know anything above that. So that can result in a lot of things that, on the one hand, can be considered ahistorical, but most of all, they work against the basic assumptions of a historical wargame. And how does red fit in this? Well, as was mentioned by both my colleagues before, how red plays the game largely impacts the quality of the game overall, based on red not just being a dummy that is played against. If I could please have the next slide. Thank you. A significant problem with red in historical games specifically is vilification. For narrative purposes, many games, especially those designed for entertainment or education, but not exclusively, tend to present the playing teams with a certain bias, depending on the design purposes, aims, and motivations. One might even call it a moral judgment. In that case, red automatically becomes the default bad guys. And it can be warranted, it can be not warranted. It entirely depends on the specific topic and the game. Whether it is World War II Nazis, barbarians in the Roman times, or even, say, the British in the American Revolution, the premise is that Team Red are the ones that the game creators have a judgment about, and more specifically against. This trope makes playing red either become discouraged, as some players just specifically don't like playing villains, or in other situations, it leads to players playing red fitting in the trope of villains perhaps too well, leading to the situation where they just follow a stereotypical villain rather than following the goals that were in mind. Yes, whether or not such narratives are justified or not, because as mentioned, they absolutely can be. This is kind of forcing the red player into a specific box. And it doesn't always have to be the case. Yes, so in this case, generally, even when it is understandable to have a specific team be villains in the realities of the game design forces the hand of the red player to get in character automatically as a villain. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. But the most significant problem with red teaming in historical games is breaking a game. As was mentioned, especially by my colleague Alex in the beginning of the presentation, breaking the game doesn't have to be something bad when it is coming from the red team, because it can, it can be a good learning possibility for the designers, but also it can be very well intended. However, breaking a historical game can happen in a different way as well. So in historical games, breaking the mechanics becomes easier due to the availability of hindsight. So naturally, designers should be able to foolproof their games for that eventuality. The problem is that being difficult. For example, let's say there is a game about the 1920 Battle of Warsaw. And historically, the Poles were able to win that battle because their intelligence suggested the existence of a gap between the northern and the southern parts of the attacking Soviet force. And a counteroffensive was run through that gap. But if there was a game like that, the Soviet player, having the historical knowledge about the topic, would know to plug that gap, no matter anything else, any other developments within the game. So game designers have to be able to find a justifiable way to make such decisions possible or not. If there is reasonable suspicion in-game that the enemy has such intel, then yes, it's absolutely should be allowed. But if the only reason for making this move would be historical knowledge, the hindsight, then that is unwarranted, and in my opinion, should be prevented, as it is the wrong kind of breaking the game. This dilemma leads to an interesting dynamic in historical games where players might tend to specifically go out of their way not to make the same moves as their original historical counterparts. It is partly because players hope to find better alternatives, but partly because any historical move would be considered predictable, and knowledge of the topic acts as an additional layer of intel. This is a serious problem of historical wargaming, and sadly, this one does not have an easy way out. But I will reference it in one of my later slides a bit more as well. Before I move on, the second map I've included in this slide is the 480 BC Battle of Thermopylae, where I also believe this is a very good additional example of historical hindsight being able to break the game, because if there was a game about this battle, then, from the perspective of Red, historical hindsight is that there was another passage through the mountains to the rear of the defending force, except this is hindsight. So on the merit of knowing this from history alone, this is not necessarily a reason enough to win the game outright. Okay, if I could please have the next slide. Thank you. Another issue that's a bit similar to the trope of the Team Red being villains, there's also a trend that can be seen where Red is little more than a challenge that Blue has to overcome. It kind of connects to what Alex said, for example, when mentioning how Red doesn't necessarily have an independent function in around corporations' hegemony. Because of this, we see two main types of goals that Blue tends to have, and as much as it can also be true for contemporary games, it is especially so for historical ones. The first kind of goal from Blue can be to beat Red, which is very straightforward, understandable. Or when it is historically expected that Blue cannot win, historically Blue didn't win, or the design doesn't want that for narrative purposes. Then, for narrative purposes, the Blue goal can be to delay Red, or make sure that Red's victory is costly. In which case, Blue's aim is to perform better than history. But what does either of those say about Red? If Blue is intended to win, then the game tends to be balanced specifically so that it is possible for Blue to win with a certain level of effort. Not too challenging, but to allow most players, especially in commercial games, to achieve that. If Blue's aim is a heroic defeat, however, then Red tends to be well equipped to overwhelm Blue no matter what. But in either case, the game does not tend to be designed so that playing Red is really engaging, because Red serves as a dummy for Blue to be conquered or to be defended against. How can this be solved? One simple way: give Red more agency. Agency to prioritize between different goals, if there are multiple. Agency to participate in creating the narrative, and not be strictly constrained by the narrative itself. Improving the experience of Red players can vastly improve the game overall, as was stressed by my colleagues before, including the player's immersion. Immersion will be covered in more detail by Evan later. But on this topic here, generally, in terms of historical games, immersion is something that tends to give Red way more value, a much better experience, as generally immersion results in more reliability when it comes to the realities of the game and of the period chosen. So not only the game becomes more engaging, but also it does become less possible to break it in a way not envisioned upon design. Okay, and if I could please have the next slide now. Thank you. And now, the final issue I would like to discuss is player suggestibility. It's very much referencing the idea of breaking a historical game from earlier. It is easy to come up with original ideas when there is no expected template. But history is one huge template of this kind. And no matter the amount of effort, it can be difficult not to think in those categories when historical knowledge is available. Players can end up either following the historical solutions because they believe them to have been the best possible choice, or they can avoid historical choices at all costs, wanting to prove that they can be smarter than that. One way to overcome this is to introduce just enough ahistorical elements to make the original historical decisions, well, useless for game purposes, forcing the players to think of the situation from the ground up. Ahistoricity in general can achieve many things, as much as it might not necessarily seem very, for lack of a better word, distinguished. Ahistoricity can definitely bring a lot of value to a historical game, as not only can it divert the player attention from following original historical patterns and repeating decisions that were historically made, but also it can steer the overall mood and immersion of the game in a specific direction. Addition of certain ahistorical elements can lead the game to become more satirical or even a caricature if needed. Even if not needed, then that is a problem that can happen accidentally as well. But also an addition of certain other ahistorical elements can most definitely lead to steering the game in a certain direction. For example, resulting in emphasizing a certain area, emphasizing a certain element of the team, be that red or blue. Another solution is to pick scenarios that players might be not familiar with. So usage of niche topics can help. And building on that, non-niche topics can be disguised as such. You can have a game that is, let's say, about a certain moment during the Great Game in 1880s Afghanistan. But what it is effectively about is a certain moment in, let's say, the 7 Years' War. As long as there are enough parallels that you can translate the situation to another, it is possible to disguise topics as one another. And then whatever the new layer of, the new top layer of how the topic appears to be, you decide to choose, this is how players are going to react. So in that case, you can just strip the layer they're familiar with and still maintain the same balance, faction dynamics, etc. And the third and final choice can be to embrace and accept the situation that players will be familiar with the historical background of your game. These situations are inevitable in historical wargaming. Sometimes you will encounter this, but when acknowledged, it can be a good exercise in deciding when to follow historical course of action and when not to, as well as this is exactly how you create good historical games. You can make players benefit when they appear to have more knowledge on the background. You can actually give players advantages when they act in a way that clearly shows they understand the realities. All right, I believe that would be it from me. So thank you very much, and I will now pass on to my next colleague.
Thank you, Nathan. And hi, everyone. I'm Baptiste Alloui-Cros. I'm basically specialized in artificial intelligence and wargaming at SSG. And so my presentation will be on red teaming with artificial intelligence, opportunities and pitfalls. Hopefully I can make it short and sweet. So everything I'm going to talk about is based on the work and research I did for my master's thesis at King's College, which will soon be publicated. So feel free to contact me for explicit references on more on the topic. Okay, next slide. So yeah, strategy. Why do I start on strategy on the topic on artificial intelligence and wargaming? Well, because I believe wargaming is all about making us better strategists as a whole. And the framework we're gonna look at in the next 2 slides is going to be very useful to better understand how AI can be implemented in wargaming, really, especially regarding red teaming. So yeah, the definition that you can see on your screen, which is strategy is the creative combination of all available means and ideas to reach one desired end and amidst uncertainty and despite opposing wills, is the one I privilege the most because I think it's simple enough. It refers to what I call the strategic triangle that you can see on the right. So this triangle represents what strategy is, or how it can best be abstracted. So you see there is one side about stochastic. It's basically randomness, hazardousness, which is peculiar to warfare and strategy as a whole. Heuristic, which we will talk a lot about, which is basically the combination of means and ideas. On dialectic, which is the confrontation of wills, the confrontation of psychologies between two opponents, resorting to strategy. This idea of strategic triangle, by the way, is not from me. It's from Quentin Sancier, who has an excellent YouTube channel on the art of war, and Antoine Bourguignon, who is a French historian of wargaming. Okay, so why do I bring this triangle up? Because I think what red teamers typically lack of in wargaming is heuristics, which means they have less freedom of action to combine means and ideas in their gameplay, and that's problematic. So that's why we're gonna dig more into that. Next slide, please. Okay. Regarding heuristic again, I like the Napoleonic core principles regarding strategy, which are bon sens, in English, judgment, and imagination, creativity. So Napoleon didn't really have a proper doctrinal art of war written down, of course, but it still had this emphasis on those two elements. And well, what I like with it is that you cannot have one without the other. You need to be able to correctly assess the options you and your opponent have, so to have a good judgment, and have enough imagination to figure out new ones, to come up with unexpected combinations, because you always need surprise in strategy. So that's creativity. And of course, if you only have a very limited number of options, even if you can assess them very well and understand if they are good or bad, if you're unable to come up with more ideas, probably you're not going to surprise your opponent, which in the case your red teamer can be quite an issue. And similarly, if you have plenty of ideas, but you are unsure how useful they are, then you are again stuck with the problem. So to me, it's really the art of effective red teaming is to be able to have this combination of good judgment and especially creativity. And be able to come up with all those ideas. And so it's all about really recombining the means you have, so the physical means you have, using the rules of the game, and on new ideas. Next slide, please. All right, so finally we come to the topic of AI proper. So by the way, when I'm talking about artificial intelligence here, I'm basically talking about connectionist AIs built upon machine learning models. So to give a few examples, AlphaZero in chess, AlphaGo in Go, or more recently Libratus with poker, or Kikero with diplomacy. So those AIs, they all have this common point, this common strength of being extremely good at recreating combinations of means. So the chess position you see here is an instance from AlphaZero. It really shocked chess players at the time because AlphaZero was able to come up with new ideas, totally novel ideas, whereas the game of chess was around for millennia. And it was able to come up with those new ideas, and that for some of them we knew and we used to use them separately from one another, but the way it was recombining those ideas was really novel. And so that's the specificity of AI in games. It's that they are incredibly good at heuristics. In a way, one could almost say they are Jominian strategies, AIs that are focused on maps, geometry, on numbers. And so in that sense, they are creative, which can be surprising at first, but they truly are creative. They come up with those unexpected ways of dealing with a problem. They come up with unexpected challenging tactics and strategies that really do add a layer of depth to traditional human red teaming. Because human red teaming is all about that, creating surprise, changing your opponent with new ideas that he won't see coming. Okay, next slide, please. So really in the eye of the machine, there is no such thing as blue or red. That's in some regards very interesting because it will treat both sides very equally. It doesn't care about the game design itself. And that's kind of what we want, because in war, those colors, they do not mean anything at the end of the day. So for analysis' sake, we want an adversary that uses the full spectrum of what it's capable of doing. And an AI will always precisely do that. It will exploit the rules to the maximum. So it will be bending those rules and expose, if not all nuances, at least many new nuances of the strategic struggle that is taking place. And that's very interesting from both the designer point of view, because if an AI shows that, well, your game is really easy to break, that can be actually a real issue. So that's useful for the designer. That's also useful from the analyst point of view and from the player point of view, because it just generates new ideas, new hypotheses, new strategies, new ways of playing. Well, that's why we're doing wargaming, and that's why we are doing red teaming. So yeah, it really has two main assets, this innovative red teaming and the benefits of addressing unintended issues and allow the game designer to readdress the game balance, etc., etc. Okay, next slide, please. So now about the limits. We come back to the strategic triangle once again, because we just saw that heuristics were really AI's forte. But what about dialectics? As I said before, the dialectic component of this triangle, it relates to everything like the confrontation of will, so everything related like to the cultural, psychological, political side of both opponents. The will to dissent, etc. All those human factors in warfare. And the AI really is not doing great in that sphere at all. It cannot comprehend what it is to dissent. It cannot comprehend politics. It cannot comprehend culture, which is a major drawback. So you cannot use AI for everything, and that's something we're gonna see. In particular, it will never break rules. So I think it relates quite well to what Alex said just before, that one of the best things you can do as a red teamer is to break the rules. Well, the AI will never break the rules, and that's quite an issue, because very often you're happy when red break those rules and give you an interesting argument for why it should be able to do it. It allows you to redesign the game way more effectively, and it's of course useful for analysis' sake. And also, all analytical wargames are imperfect models, so the rules are always relative that you want it or not, and they are never absolute, since you can always do better in terms of game design. Another thing is that AI tends to win by the slightest margin. So what do I mean when I say that? That, for instance, in the game of Go, AlphaGo will always win by 1 point in general, which is weird because as humans, we are maximalists. We like to take a lot so that if there is a problem, we can allow ourselves to lose a bit. The AI works differently. It will try to figure out the safest way to win. And as long as it wins from 1 point, it doesn't really care which way is the way to go. And that's not really realistic because, of course, humans, they always are maximalists and they do not like to have Pyrrhic victory or 1 point victory. We like to have grandiose, big victories. So that's not very realistic from AI. So in that way, it cannot replace human red teaming. It's only an enhancement in some very specific regards, but it's a powerful enhancement with heuristics. And that's precisely because it's not concerned with psychology that it's so powerful. It can suggest very unethical actions. Like most of you know the story according to which the Americans, after the War of the Pacific, expected everything from the Japanese but the kamikaze. Well, you can very easily imagine a game where if the rules are loose enough, an AI would use kamikaze tactics as long as it maximizes its winning chances. So you say an AI will never comprehend cultural things or ethics, but it will still be able to use them as long as it sees it fitting in a winning strategy. Okay, next slide, please. So to finish on this topic, to go a bit beyond the limits, I wanted to talk a little bit about large language models that are having large success currently. I mean, they've been taking all over the news. So the critique that I've just done regarding AI, that it cannot comprehend the cultural factors, etc., of course still holds, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Because if you take Kikero, which is the AI produced by Meta, I think, to play the game of diplomacy, Kikero use large language models technologies to play the game, and diplomacy is a very psychological game. In order to win at diplomacy, you need to convince other players, you need to lie to other players. And it's something that intuitively one might think an AI would not be able to do this well. Kikero is actually really good on beating the best diplomacy players. So that's not all that simple. Okay, if you develop a large language model and you feed it all the doctrines of your enemy, if you educate him with the literature that your enemy produces and read, then you might very well get a pretty convincing red teamer on its own right. So that's not something that has been done already from what I know, but it's something I would be interested to see once large language models get stronger and easier to use, I guess. Okay, to finish on this topic, my conclusion, main take on this is that while AI can enhance red teaming, it is so special and so specific that it should be always considered as a third hidden player, I would say. What I mean is that pretty much any wargame can be adapted to be played by an AI, because a game has rules, a game has objectives. It's easy to maximize for an AI. I'm not saying that all games can be played by an AI, but many games can be used and played by an AI. It doesn't mean, of course, that it's always useful to have an AI play your game. Far from that. In particular, it would be more interesting to have an AI play your game if the heuristic component is large enough. I mean, if the game space is large enough and the possibilities are numerous. Also, for a very political and psychological game, it's probably not going to be very useful to have an AI play it. But I think in many cases, we will be surprised in the future by the results of having AI play those games. And I think the AI's feedback can be really useful for generating new hypotheses for red teaming and for improving those game designs' overall quality. So if you're interested in this topic, I treat everything in detail in my master thesis that will be up and published soon enough, hopefully. Yeah, I hope it was clear enough. And on this last note, I will give the hand to my colleague Ivan.
So I obviously am Evan D'Alessandro. I am going to be talking specifically about immersion and how that produces better red teaming in games. Next slide, please. So before I kind of get into the actual thing, I want to give a list of caveats to everything I'm about to say, which is kind of first, this is looking at red teaming kind of at the highest level, which looks at it in an adversarial sense. So I'm looking at kind of the rest versus the West rather than sorts of like different types or different functions of red teams. I'm not looking at internal red teaming of kind of like industry or government or those sorts of things. I'm very interested in kind of two groups who are kind of have very different worldviews. The next thing is that this is all kind of general advice, right? So like it doesn't apply in all cases. You always need to tailor stuff to the game that you have. And then the third part of that is that all of this is drawing on my PhD research. I'm a PhD student at King's College London. And I'm studying immersion in professional wargaming. And so everything I'm about to say here is drawn from my reading of the reviewed literature thus far, not from any experimentation I've done. And that kind of, as a result of all of that, none of what I'm saying here is necessarily set in stone. I may discover things that cause me to reevaluate different bits of that. Next slide, please. So kind of before I get into the actual immersion bit, I kind of want to like lay out my argument from the start, which is I'm going to argue at the very least, it's really easy to think like blue because you wake up every day and you are blue and you eat, sleep, and dream blue, and you go to work and it's blue, and all these sorts of things that are just kind of inherent to our society just kind of get ingrained in you from birth, right? It's a very like anthropological argument, but like I think it's true, right? Like all of us, if you ask us, we're going to say that, you know, probably democracy is a good thing. We like human rights. We don't like authoritarian systems, don't indiscriminately shell civilians, right? Like that's just kind of an innate like standpoint that we take because that's what we're exposed to every day. The flip side of that, obviously, it's a lot harder to think like red because you're not brought up in that same tradition every day, right? Most of us have not lived in an authoritarian state. If we did, we were probably afforded protection as a foreigner and not a citizen of that state. And as a result, you lack that kind of innate understanding of how red thinks, right? In the broadest possible sense, right? Because it's just not a lived experience, right? You have to go out and get that knowledge rather than just being exposed to it. So next slide. So my solution to that, or at least the solution I'm going to claim, is that you should immerse the players. Immersed players are more likely to have embodiment, which means that they're more likely to act, think, and be like the character or the agency or the actor they are supposed to be representing. They're more likely to react realistically when things happen in a game and respond to things as they would if they were that actor. And they're more likely to be invested in the outcome of that game, which kind of, as a summation of things, means that they're more likely to be like red and act like red, which obviously, if you're red teaming, is something you want red to do, right? So my contention here is that you should be designing explicitly to immerse your red players because it produces a better game output. And kind of like the perfect sort of world of this would be at the end of the game, the players look up from their immersed stupor at each other and say, wait a second, aren't we the baddies? Not having realized while they were playing the game, they've shed all of their kind of inhibitions of blue and have fully taken on that red persona until the end of the game. Next slide. So I keep on talking about immersion, but what actually is it? And this is a great question. And the answer to that question is unbelievably complex. No one agrees on any definition. There's no definition in the context of board games. There's especially no definition in the context of war games. And there's no context in the definition of professional war games. Within the places that have them, sometimes the definitions are very close. Sometimes they are radically different. So I'm going to not propose a single sentence definition of anything. I'm not erudite enough to do that. I haven't done enough work yet to do that. But I'm going to kind of work around what immersion is. So you won't have a definition of it, but you can know it when you see it. And the first thing I'll contend is that immersion is a continuum. You can have players that are more or less immersed over time in a game, and players will shift up and down and be more or less immersed. It is not a light switch. The players are not immersed or not immersed. They can be somewhere in there, and different things happen to them at different points. Then the other thing I'll say is I think immersion presents with some symptoms. The first kind of set of those is losing track of time, flow, if you know what the concept of flow is, or real world disassociation, right? And kind of the summation of all of those is that kind of feeling when you sit down to play a game and you realize it's been like 3 hours and it's just, flashed by. That's kind of what that is. Kind of the next thing is like you'll feel like you're in the game or in the game world, which is this concept that's called presence. So you'll feel like you are in the North Korean nuclear bunker, or you'll feel like you're in Star Wars or whatever, right? The players will feel like they are in the game. And then kind of the third thing is emotional engagement with the game as a whole, which is generally like, I really want to win this game, or I don't want to lose, right? And or the characters, which can be things like empathization with characters or identification with characters, which is then a different thing to becoming a character, which is embodiment, right? And so kind of emotions and engagement are another sort of thing. But the thing with all of those is that those can all to a certain degree be explained by other concepts, right? The ones at the top can be explained by flow or disassociation or selective attention. The ones in the middle can be explained by presence. The one in the bottom can be explained by emotions or engagement, right? And all these concepts overlap with the flow of with immersion, right? And so when you see immersion, you'll also see these other things. And where the boundary is between those and immersion, I don't think there is a hard boundary, right? I think these things mix together. However, the thing that is unique to immersion, right, that nothing else has a mechanism to explain and can explain, is the idea of special meanings from Salin and Zimmerman in Rules of Play, which is actually quite simple, right? It basically just means that these things that are on the board or these things that are in the game cease meaning like their actual thing and become something that they aren't, right? And what that means, because I've just used various fancy speak to explain a very simple concept, is it means that that infantry marker, right, which is literally just a cardboard chit with some like numbers on it and maybe a little like infantry icon, right? That ceases being just a cardboard chit and that actually becomes an infantry platoon, right? And you think about it as an infantry platoon and you command it as an infantry platoon. And when you lose it, you feel like you've lost an infantry platoon, not that you've just lost a chit. In that special meanings, right? And this doesn't just apply to military units, it can be supplies, it can be anything else. Are all of these are things that are explainable through special meanings. And that's the unique factor of immersion. So next slide. So if immersion is happening, what does that actually do? What effect does that have on the game? And I'm going to contend that there's kind of like three large subjects of things. One of those is that immersed players are more likely to have embodiment, which means that they're more likely to be and think like the people that they're supposed to be, generally. I'll caveat this towards the end. But what that means is that if someone's playing the game and the more immersed they are, the more they are going to think like red. And a lot of examples I'm probably going to use in this are US, China, modern stuff, because that's the game I'm working on. So just bear with me as I use the same example over and over again and beat a dead horse. But if you tell the person that you want them to play a Chinese admiral, the more immersed they are, or the more embodiment they have, the more they are going to act like that Chinese admiral, think like that Chinese admiral, and react like that Chinese admiral. Now, what that means, and there's other mechanisms to get to this realistic reaction, but part of it is embodiment, right? But what you also have here is you'll have reacting realistically to things, right? And this is some combination of special meanings, right? Like those things become real. Also the emotional investments, like I don't want to lose, or, this unit has defended this outcrop for like 6 turns. I don't want to see them pushed off at their heroes, right? All of that kind of leads to this emotional attachment in a game to various objects. And that leads to irrational thinking, which is just how people think, which is what you want to happen, right? Because it means they're reacting realistically. If people are putting undue emotional value on things and not looking at stuff clinically, great, because that's how people think. And then kind of the output of that is kind of this third thing, which is people are more invested in the outcome of the game, right? Like not only do they want to win, but they may specifically want smaller subparts of that, or they may want some other outcome, right? And that's really, really important just from a investment standpoint, because a disinterested red is not producing the outcomes that you want. If you want red who's going in there trying to break the game or trying to win or trying to meet the learning objective, whatever it is, and you want them as interested as possible in winning, and you want them as interested as possible in trying to meet the outcome of that game, right? And so the more immersed the players are, the more they're going to be working towards that, and the better of an outcome you're going to get from the game. And basically my contention here overall is that what immersion is really good at doing is it's really good at helping you shed those ideas that you hold innately and replacing with the ones you should have, right? Shedding your lived blue ideas and replacing them temporarily with red ideas and red thinking. Next slide. So all of this said, immersion is like a really, really finicky beast. It is hyper-specific to individuals. It is hyper-specific to groups, right? Me, for example, I find music to be really, really impactful on immersing me in games. I have friends who cannot stand music. They're like, I will use ambience, but no music, right? With groups, the techniques I'm going to use to immerse a group of students versus a bunch of government people versus a bunch of military officers, completely different because they'll react differently to different things, right? So what I'm about to say kind of in the next couple of set of slides, remember that these will not apply in all cases and that you need to tailor them specifically to the group you are trying to immerse. Next slide. So simple immersive techniques, right? Like how do you actually do this thing? This is like the practical part of the talk, right? The useful bit. I would start with the kind of the most base level stuff, which is the room, right? The physical space and sound of a room is actually really important for immersion, right? Think about the seating, the size of the room, and the amount of light in the room, right? If you put all the people at a round table, they're all on the same team. But if you put people on 2 opposite sides of the table, on a square table or a rectangular table, you've created 2 teams, right? Like there's an innate psychology to just like putting people at tables, right? How many seats you have, right? Like if you don't have enough seats around the table, and that's the only table in the room, people are going to be standing, which means they're more likely to move around and potentially go out of the room to meet with other teams. Like stuff like that affects how players play the game and affects their immersion. It also means stuff like posters, right? Like if I'm playing a game about Cuba and there's a poster of Fidel Castro, every time I look up, I'm immediately reminded that I'm supposed to be playing a Cuban in this game, right? Music and ambience and just like the external sound can be really, really important, right? If you're playing a command post game, having the sound of distant artillery thunder will make the players think they are more like that. They're more present in that game world than the real world. But all of those things I just kind of talked about also relate to this idea of removing distractors or creating real world disassociation, right? Where what you want to do is you want to replace the stimuli of the real world with the stimuli of the game world, right? So what you want to do is remove potentially things that will distract them, right? So that can be things like they will see the sun go down behind them and they'll realize that time is passing. Right? When I run games, I really want to have them in a place where there's not windows because I want the players to be kind of in a liminal space out of time. If there's kind of people in the hallway outside, I really like to have music. I really like to have ambience because it helps cover up people moving outside. It prevents players from being distracted by those things and it keeps them immersed, right? So that's kind of like, just like at a very base level, like very simple things you can do. Priming, I think, is also a really important thing, and priming players to think and act in certain ways. Think about the way you present information in a game, right? I always change the font that I use in games. If I'm running a sci-fi game, I change it to a sci-fi font. If I'm running a professional game, I use Times New Roman. I do not use the default stock font because people will recognize it as the default stock font, and they'll immediately be like, this is just like real life, right? You can think about the national names for things, like what you're calling islands, what you're calling Taiwan in a game, right? Like that should be correct for that nation and for what they call it. Because if you call it the wrong thing, it will break players out of immersion. They say this is wrong, right? If you say the right thing, they'll say, oh yeah, actually we have this different name that everyone else uses this name, but we use this name, and they'll use that name, right? And it will immerse them in that red mindset. The other thing is there's kind of like very simple personal and real world disassociation tools, right, which help you move towards like embodiment and help you kind of become less distracted. Things like character and role name badges, really, really simple thing, right? But they're very, very effective, right? If I have a name badge on, right, especially if I'm going to a game where I don't know the other people and the name on it is printed, say it's 1918 Spartacist Uprising in Germany, and my name tag says Rosa Luxemburg on it, right? And the people don't know me, so they keep on calling me Rosa Luxemburg. I'm going to be a lot more immersed than if my name was on there and it's Evan, right? And there's like, hey, Evan. And I'm like, I'm playing Rosa Luxemburg, but if you call me Rosa Luxemburg, I'm going to be a lot more immersed, right? Hats. I don't know what it is about hats, but hats are like a crack for immersion. Like you put on a hat and there's an instant like mindset shift. The person is now a completely different person. I don't know what it is. Hats are magic for some reason. The other thing I think is really useful is propaganda videos. That thing up in the top corner is a Chinese propaganda video I like to screen. Propaganda videos are really, really effective. James Fielder gave a really good presentation, I think, at Georgetown about the magic circle. And I think one of the points he got at really well in there is that playing a propaganda video or playing some sort of thing at the start of the game helps delineate between the real world and the game world. And once you play that propaganda video, you've got them in the same room, right? Like once that video started playing, like they are now in the game world and their mindset shifts to that, right? And you can start immersing them a lot easier because they're not kind of still hanging on there in the real world. All of a sudden, there's this clear demarcation between real world and game, and they can start to be immersed easier. Now, challenge is an interesting thing, right? And to me, I think challenge is probably most impactful in terms of affecting distractors, right? And there's some positive aspects of it, but I'm just going to kind of mainly talk about using challenge to prevent negative things here. Is that what you want to always do is have players like, this is very simple, right? But like always have the players like doing something, right? Like always give the players something like that is appropriately challenging them, and giving them busy work is just boring, right? And so you want to give them an appropriate challenge, and you always want to have them doing something, because if they're not, then they'll be bored and then they'll disengage, right? And they're more likely to be distracted by things. And you have this really virtuous cycle, I think, in immersion, where the more immersed someone is, the less likely they are to be distracted. So the more likely they are to be immersed and the less likely they are to be distracted. And that just kind of self-reinforcing loop, right? But challenge is a decent part of that, right? Like always giving them something to do prevents them from stopping and being like, oh, wait, we're playing the game. Whereas if you're saying like, I need that order in the next 30 seconds or those units aren't moving, they're frantically filling that and they don't have a time to disengage, right? Emotion, I think, is a thing that's really important to design around for immersion, right? And I have this thing in the bottom corner where I've got a bunch of different things. I've got frustration, I've got happiness, I've got tension. It's like games are inherently like emotional sorts of things. And for immersion, what you want in that is you want players to identify with the nation or the agency or the actor or the character, right? And you want to try and design things as much as possible so they can identify with them. And generally, the easiest way to do that, right, is like people identify really well with things that they have a relation to in real life. So if I have a player who's is in the Air Force in real life, what I'll do is I'll make them the head of the RAF in my Battle of Britain game, because that's something they can immediately identify with, right? And so like typecasting comes into this, right? Just like players' interests, that sort of stuff works really well for identification because they have an innate emotional connection to that thing, right? The other part of that is narrative and how emotions interact with narrative. Like games are inherently narrative objects, right? Like when we talk about narrative and we talk about games, where it's like always like, well, we were playing the game and then X happened. And so then, Y thing happened because of that. And then we took Z decision, right? Like that's a narrative framing of how the game happened and like what a game is, right? And the thing about like narratives is that the reason we like narratives is because they're really emotional things, right? Like you want to turn the next page, you want to watch the next episode, right? Like it's why we binge watch stuff, right? It's like you have an emotional investment in the characters, you have an emotional investment in the plot, like you want to win, you want one side to win, right? And the great thing about games is that it's interactive. You can try and make one side win, right? And so trying to feed back player emotion into the narrative can be really important, right? Like if I see the players all of a sudden, like they're super interested in this one ship or this little, one plucky ship has managed to avoid being destroyed the entire game. Like you better believe I'm going to give the players specific feedback on that ship every turn because they're really invested in the story of that specific ship, right? So like you can do stuff not only from like the game design perspective, but also from the facilitation and adjudication perspective as you're doing stuff to play into that player emotion, right? And kind of like change how their emotion is being used to immerse them further and kind of absorb them further into the narrative in the game. Now, meta-knowledge is another aspect of this. And I'm, again, just only going to talk about the negative aspect of this. And kind of very simply, right, like meta-knowledge can be I guess actually meta knowledge can be good, right? When the players like it, like players self-select for games a lot of times, not as much in professional war games, but what will happen is it's like, oh, I'm really into World War II, so I'm going to want to play this World War II game. They're more likely to be immersed simply because they really like World War II. And there's a whole interesting discussion there. But the flip side of that can be if you get things wrong in there, right? Players will be like, wait a second, this thing is wrong. And that will snap them out of immersion, right? So you want to try and get stuff as right as possible. And you want to try and get like the technical details or have some explanation for something. And this comes probably more into facilitation than design, because in design is just like get the stuff right. Whereas in facilitation, it's like you've screwed up, figure out how to like convince them that you didn't screw up. But when players have meta knowledge about something, this is how missile combat works, or, this is how, train timetabling works or whatever, right? Like getting those details wrong can snap them out of immersion. And you want to avoid that if at all possible. And if you do screw it up, cover it up so the player doesn't realize it. And then the other thing is other players, right? Immersion is like a socially mediated sort of thing. It's an agreement between players in a game. And if you see the people around you being immersed, you have permission. There's a permission structure to allow you to be more immersed, right? If I go and I'm playing a game and everyone else is in a hat and using a terrible accent for a Versailles game, right? I'm more likely to also put on a hat and also put on a terrible accent. Whereas if no one else is doing that, I'm going to probably feel kind of silly doing that unless I know everyone else, right? And so kind of structuring the players and kind of like warming the players up in like a comedy sense to be more immersed and allow for more immersion and kind of create like a zone where people can feel free to be immersed is really, really important in kind of how you design the game and how you kind of prime the players to do that sort of stuff. Next slide. So this is my like red flag in the ground. Be careful. This really only works if the players know how red works and thinks, right? If the players don't know how red works and thinks, what they will do is they'll have a caricature of red that's how they think it works. Right? As Thomas was talking about, right? Like I'm ISIS, so I just do crazy stuff, right? And that's what they'll do because they don't actually understand how ISIS works, right? And you can have these sorts of problems be inflamed by immersion. However, if the players do know how red works, what you'll do is the more you immerse them, the more you'll move them out of blue and into that red mindset, right? And what I'll contend here is that immersion does not make a person think more like red, but that immersion does get a person to think more like red, but doesn't teach them how to think like red, right? Like they need to go out and do the reading, or you need to teach them or run them through the program or whatever to get them to understand how red thinks. And then immersion will go and do the job of making them think like red. Next slide. So this is my little conclusion bit, which is that I think it's important that you immerse your players. This goes for red and blue. Basically, most of the stuff I've talked about also applies for blue. But for red, it's especially valuable because people's lived lives are not red. Their lived lives are blue, right? And that kind of, in some, it will not teach them to be red. But if you do immersion properly, and the more you immerse players, the more it will make them act like red, and the better game outcome you will have. Next slide. If you want any of a reading list onto immersion, I'll linger here for just a moment so you can take a screen capture. These are some good introductory texts I would recommend to that end. And then we will take questions as we get presented with them. So in a professional wargame, the red side is often a lot smaller than blue and tends to function as a unitary actor, despite the fact that red probably has as many factions as blue. Can you speak a little more about what you want to do to prevent red from being unnaturally unified? Thomas, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah, that's one of the points that I emphasized during my presentation. And that's also a point that Alex underlined during his presentation when he was talking about hegemony and saying that, well, you could have China, the DPRK, Iran and Russia all playing together to try to break the game. Or, for example, having to try to avoid this kind of situation, you will need to be very specific on the objective you are giving the player. Because if you are giving different objectives and if you order them correctly, they will not be the same. And despite the fact that they are all red, they will need to act differently because maybe the aim they will have at the end, their end goal, will be slightly different or in a slightly different fashion. One another way to do it is to create a zero-sum game. If one red player is able to win, maybe he's gonna win more than the other red player, which will create competition, and that's what you want. You want to create competition among all of the red players in a way that will allow fighting within the team or fighting within between the different players. So make sure to create competition and make sure to work, I would say, clearly on the objectives. Yeah. Do you think face-to-face games impede the ability to play red due to players' knowledge or respect for each other?
I'll take this.
Yeah.
Right, I think there's a priori question to this, right, which is kind of like, how do people interact with each other, and about like how social stratification works in games and like kind of like social hierarchies work in games, right? Before we get to the question about face-to-face, which is entirely dependent on kind of like how people are organized, right? Like, there's a classic thing of like start with a junior officer when discussing a plan and then work your way up to the general. But really, it also depends on things like if there's like, if I'm friends with people and I'm playing a game, I'm gonna play it a lot differently. Right, like if I'm playing a game against like Alex, and I'm red and Alex is blue, I'm going to go all out to try and screw over Alex, right? Because I know he would do the exact same thing to me. But if I'm playing it like with a bunch of people I don't know, I'm probably going to play it very, very differently, right? Right, and like that's kind of like, there's a whole bit to that, and kind of like I kind of know how Alex plays things, and I know he's conniving, right? And like there's sort of like that sort of like bit that happens before you get to like face-to-face to online. However, face-to-face games, I think the thing you get in a face-to-face game is that is not necessarily, or at least I would charge, is communications faster, right? And red has to be more reactive. And I think red doesn't have the luxury of being able to necessarily hide away from other people. Like online, it's a lot harder to go out and seek people out, whereas in red, like in person, it's a lot harder. Right, and this is kind of tangentially answering your question, Nick. Sorry, right, but I think there's kind of like that bit that comes before like knowing thy enemy, and then the other thing is because you're interacting so much, I think you get more information about how people interact in a face-to-face game as red or blue than you would in an online game where the just general amount of communication and interaction is a lot lower. That's my initial contention. Alex, should probably disagree with me on this for the sake of balance.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree, but I think this is really a question where you have benefits and trade-offs more than anything else. Like, you will have some issues of the player knowledge and respect may affect things, as Evan's kind of approached. But I think another thing to really consider is, even if there are these trade-offs, there's also opportunities out of it. Being able to really work with that psychological aspect, really able to work with that direct person-to-person communication, what that means for playing the game, I think is something that you gain even if you put things at risk. And I think that gain, even regardless of anything else, is valuable enough to warrant this potential risk.
So what can you recommend for people who want to get better at designing red? Education works to read, topics to research, etc. I've obviously put up my set of things on immersion, but I'll let everyone else jump in with their stuff.
I would say more than anything else is playing games. The best way to learn how to design a red game is to play as red, because a lot of things that red can or should do are not immediately clear. A lot of the ways that red might want to interact to break a game are not abundantly clear. So the more you actually are just playing these games and seeing how they function, how does it feel to play as red? How does it feel to play as red if you can't do shit? How does it feel to play as red if you can do a whole lot? In a case like that, that I think is going to give you probably some of the best actual education of how to design a red game.
I guess I could also say my piece of advice would be listen to some good propaganda, because yeah, I know how it sounds, but generally I would say listen, watch, or read some nice propaganda, because then to search for the internal logic within it, because I think that's the best cure for designing red as a caricature.
To add to Alex's point about, well, if you want to better play red, you need to play games. That's true for everything within wargaming. You need to play games if you want to be better at designing games. One thing that I would add to that is that play games with people you already knew. For example, I know Alex well, and I know what he's gonna do within a game. And I know he's a very good red player, and I know that I need to better prepare myself because he's gonna have very specific strategy against me, and I know he's gonna do everything to doom me. I'm not saying that you should always play with the same people over and over again, but sometimes better knowing other people with time will allow you to better understand how they work, and you will slightly get better and better with time on how to counter their action, and therefore become a better red player.
I'll just close this by saying, if you're playing red in a kind of professional context or something, right? I'm going to go back to my point, which is like understand red, right? So like if you're going to play China or play Russia, like you need to understand if your position is, you know, Minister of Propaganda, watch the propaganda, as Natan says. If you're the military, you need to understand how their military thinks. And there's not a great, there's no cure to that other than going and actually doing the work sometimes, if you're playing it, right? But in terms of designing around it, right? Like if, the other thing there can be like, right, like you can design games where the internal logic is red's internal logic, right? It's not blue's internal logic. When we design games, we're often like, yeah, okay, like this represents how the world works and this sort of thing. Whereas like if you design it from red's perspective, a lot of these games about, you know, like alliances and in national politics and stuff would look completely different, right? So if you want to design one of those games, right, you need to understand how red thinks about the world. That'd be my last bit on this question.
Yeah, sure. So can you speak a little more about SSG and its mission? SSG was born a few months ago at the end of our master at King's College London. So that's where we all met, and basically we spent the year playing and designing games every single week. And at the end of the year, we were like, well, we might as well try to make a job out of it. So that's how SSG was born. And regarding our mission, I would say, of course, developing wargaming with a specific emphasis on diversity of opinions, points of view, on nationalities in wargaming, because we are six. Sasha unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. And we have one American, one Canadian, British, two French, and the Polish. So that's quite a good diversity nationally wise. Also regarding our specialities and centers of interest, as you could hear it tonight, we all have really our own takes, personal takes on interest in wargaming, either historical wargaming for Natan, bureaucratic politics for Thomas, immersion for Ivan, or artificial intelligence for me, or red teaming for Alex. And all this diversity makes for a lot of interesting talks and hopefully interesting designs. And all of our designs are the results of those long arguments that I think make for better games overall. Feel free to add something else if I forgot.
Oh, I can take this one. The name of the company's SSG stands for Strand Simulations Group. Basically, as was already mentioned, we all graduated from King's College London, which happens to be located at the Strand, London. So that's literally where it comes from. And this is literally where Evan and I are situated right now. Yeah, the name was honestly, I think, one of our longest discussions that we've had when we were setting up. It took longer than designing at least some of our games.
I see one question actually down all the way at the bottom, which is I'm going to call out because it's about immersion, so I'm mildly biased. How often as players become too immersed? What are the warning signs, and how to bring them back without shutting them down? Right. Okay. This is an interesting question to me, right? Because how much immersion you want, I think, is very like situationally dependent on things. And that can be, I mean, my general contention is you probably want more immersion than less, but like there's certain places where I'd be like, I don't want too much immersion because I like people won't take the game seriously potentially. Right, like that can be more a problem with kind of like people who are slightly more uptight in the higher positions in organizations. I tend to find. But I think kind of the thing you'll get, the warning sign I'll tend to get when I think players are too immersed is they'll become too emotional, right? And kind of like they become too emotionally reactive to the point where they've started to almost embody not like the person or the thing that they are, but instead they're just embodying themselves with the veneer of the person, right? Like, and that's I think less of a problem around like they're too immersed and just that they're immersed to the wrong thing, right? And I would also include like characters in that. But like occasionally you can go and be like you're too immersed, right? And that can be leading to like poor decision making, or potentially they can be like, and it can interact with other players, right? Like they can start when they start having a very emotional reaction to other players, right? That can be a problem, and I might have to step in. But there's not like a kind of like a one answer to that. I mean, generally the way to fix that is distract them in some manner, whether that's give them busy work or make them run around or do something, right? It's very classic like redirection. If you've ever like worked with children, you basically distract them by having them do something else. And that's kind of what I tend to like to do until they're kind of back down to the level I want. If it's too far, right, like I can just step in and I can just have a straight discussion with them. Like, I know you're playing this role, but you're playing it a little bit too much, right? And that's kind of like my last ditch effort for that sort of thing. But that's kind of generally at least how I personally would go around doing that. There are probably other people who are much smarter and much better game designers and facilitators than me who would say that's garbage. There's another way to do it that you're not thinking about. But that's what I got. So you're stuck with me because I'm the one on this panel. Sorry. Toma, I think this is for you.
Yeah,
I think it's for Thomas.
I will answer that question. So you have multiple ways to follow us. First, if you want to discover who we are, we have a website, Strand Simulations Group, all put together, strandsimulationsgroup.com. And for in terms of following each of us, there is a Twitter account, Strand Simulation Group. I will put it in the chat anyway. And you can also follow us on each of our individual Twitter. For example, there is Thomas Danger IR. There is, for example, Ivan D'Alessandro, Natan Pawłowski. I will put each of them in the chat. And Baptiste has a new Twitter account, I think. So not only you can follow our individual Twitter, but you can also follow the Twitter of SSG and take a look at our SSG website. And also we post quite often on LinkedIn, so you should be able to stay in touch with us. I'm writing a lot about what at SSG we are doing, what we are developing. So yeah, follow us.
And if you want to bother us or commission a game from us or get one of the games we already designed, you can email us. And for a nice fair price, we're willing to do most anything. I'll go first because I've gone first quite a bit, and I'll just continue the trend. I would say I think, I mean, I've talked a lot about immersion, but I think the thing that's kind of the prerequisite to that is a good game. Like immersion is kind of a polishing thing that makes the game work really well once you've done the actual game. And so immersion does not compensate for bad game design. It does not compensate for bad red design. It does not compensate for bad players, poor players, players who don't know the stuff about the topic, right? And so kind of doing all the legwork up to that point is great. And then you use immersion to kind of produce the good result. That would be my kind of concluding thought.
Yeah, I would say play more games, talk to more game designers, follow connections online. It sounds like a good first step.
I guess I'd also quickly say, like I've said before, a lot of what we're discussing is things that may not always be readily apparent. You might not be used to seeing some of these things happen in a game. Some of it's you've heard, some of it you haven't before. I think again, a lot of this is going to come with just practice. The more you're playing these games, the more you're building and playing games, the more these things start to make sense, and you say, "Oh no, I saw that before. I remember when this happened or that happened." Just the more practice you're getting in, the better it is to build these games, the easier it is for you.
All I can say is, really, all I can say is historical wargaming is, in my opinion, both under and overexplored. I think with enough effort, there can be way more of it. And also, mega games are fun. Please do more. Also, I believe we have a new question. So after the last remarks from Tamar.
Yeah, I show broadly what there was like different kind of all red games. So you have blue focus red all red game where you play within NATO or within the US institution or within the EU or within a Western team like that. And also you have all red game where I designed one game where one player is Wagner Group, one player is ISIS, and one player is Al Qaeda. So obviously, the way you will design the game will be really influenced by this setting. But I think the notion of game design that I show, which is again just my personal experience, and I'm not as literate as Yves and Alexandro, for example. I'm not writing a PhD on wargaming, but I think it's some interesting lesson. And because I'm the one closing with one closing remark, so maybe someone else can add something. Thank you very much for following us. Keep in touch with us. I've put the Twitter and our website on the chat. We post often, and there is interesting things coming along. Especially, I think, in terms of actuality, Baptiste will publish a lot of articles regarding wargaming. So focus on what is gonna. Yeah, you're gonna do that.
Yeah.
And that might also be a good time to mention that we'll be present at DSET.
Yeah, come at DSET. Most of us will be there at DSET in Bristol, 5 to 8 of June. There will be a SFG stand. We will be there. We will be showing game, the kind of game we design for like multiple actors, either for ourselves or for like MOD or other actors, private actors. So don't hesitate to talk to us. And yeah, we will be happy to meet you in person.
And we'll also be at some of the Connections conferences in North America as well.
I'm going to grab the mic one last time for a question on immersion, which is war stories, where I have to adjust a mid-event for an increase in immersion, and did it work or did it not work? I'll do two games here, right? And I think the interesting thing is that immersion often tends to be tied to a lot of the other game design elements, right? So the first one I'll talk about is I was doing a game that was basically I have a group of friends who play a lot of like Dungeons and Dragons together, but they don't really do a lot of like regular wargaming. And so I basically just did I did Cold War 1984 inter-German border, but it was fantasy for them, and it was going great. And the the halfway through, my computer just wouldn't load Google Slides. I was running the entire thing on Google Slides. It broke, right? Immediately, there's nothing for the players to do. So they start losing they start hemorrhaging immersion, actually would probably be the best thing for it, right? And so what I did was I quickly grabbed my second computer, the one that's my old computer, booted that one up, dragged all the players into the same room, put on some scary music, and I basically immediately escalated it to the fantasy version of a nuclear exchange, right? So I completely shifted the game. And what I did is I immediately put on music, which I hadn't been running before, because all the players in one room, I could do it. And what I basically was doing with that is I was trying to affect their emotional state with it. And that one worked really well, I think, because immediately they heard the scary music. They're all like, sad, somber music, scary music. And they're all like, oh God, right? That worked really well from a kind of emotional, like spatial point of view. The other one I would point out is I did a big modern North Korea game with most of the people here were players for. And the North Korean, the war started due to some interesting choices from various sides. And the North Korean diplomat team immediately basically just gave up. They said, the war started, there's nothing we can do, we're bored, Control hates us, they're trying to screw us over, right? There wasn't any challenge to the game anymore from them. There was also some emotional feedback in that they thought we in Control were screwing them over, which was hilarious because it was actually the South Koreans the entire time, but c'est la vie, right? And so what I had to do there to kind of like re-immerse them is I sent in Natan to go deal and say like, look, like just because a war started, like the negotiation doesn't end. Like you should immediately get out there and start either yelling at them, calling them imperialist puppets, or trying to drive a wedge between the various factions and all that sort of stuff, right? And so I sent Natan to do that, basically give them a challenge again, because that was the thing that was affecting their immersion, right? And also kind of the emotional aspect of they thought we were impacting the narrative unfairly, and basically tell them that we weren't affecting the narrative, right? They were free to affect it. And I mean, the thing with that is it didn't immediately work, right? It took them a while. I think you talked with them for about 30 minutes or something before it actually managed to convince them, right? But by the end of it, right, I think it was 6 or 7 hours later, right? Like they were the ones, every North Korean got in the same room together as they launched nuclear weapons and was singing the, North Korean national anthem together in the nuclear bunker right before they got hit by a Chinese nuclear weapon, right? So like in the end, through kind of tweaking different techniques along the line, it definitely would have, I think kind of, there was an initial kind of intervention to re-immerse them. And then we kind of did some other stuff here and there to keep them immersed. In the end, they ended up being immersed, right? But those are kind of like, it worked times. I can't think of a time it didn't work off the top of my head. It's probably because I'm just blocking it out. That's all my bit.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we're closing out.